Am I on? Perfect. All right. Thank you, everybody, for having me. So I'm given a quite, unusual task today, which is two things. One, not bore you to absolute death, and then two, to explain this very abstract, nebulous thing that we talk about when we talk about internet governance. Now, I've found from experience that very often the best way to sort of talk about these things is not so much to talk about it, but to show. Yeah? And so, how many of you have a cell phone? Perfect. How many of you use Instagram, Twitter, that kind of stuff? Perfect. I'm about to be a social media influencer. Now, hop on Twitter for a second and just go to my profile. I am Bartlett Morgan. Just go to my profile on Twitter if you have Twitter right now. Bartlett Morgan. They don't have. Who here has Twitter right now? Yes. So let's go on right now. Let's use that and let's go to Bartlett Morgan on Twitter. BartlettMorgan. Anybody on there yet? Somebody found it? All right, so let's quickly just like something, share something, comment something. Okay, good. It's happening already. So it's really hard to show you guys, but I'm getting some notifications here about activity on my account right now. Now, the question to you guys is, well, why did any of that just work? And feel free to actually answer if you want. How many of you know why any of that just worked? So, the short answer is this. It worked because of internet governance. Now, what on earth is this guy talking about? So, let's break it down just a little bit. So, when you would have taken out your phones just now and you went on Twitter, or even if you had gone on Instagram, and you navigated to my page, and maybe you liked some content, or what have you, what would have happened is this. A message would have to have been sent from your phone through your Wi-Fi router in here, on maybe through to your ISP's network, and then it would hop across several networks, and then it would eventually get to the host, which is Twitter, twitter.com or wherever they're hosted. And they'd read your message, which is really an instruction, and go, okay, well, this is what they want to do. They want to go to Bartlett Morgan's page. And then they'd send back information all across the entire internet back to your phone in a matter of a few seconds. Now, here's the funny thing. In terms of how the internet works, there's no one person or entity that runs the whole thing. All the different constituent parts that make the internet work, whenever you go on Instagram, on Snapchat, they're all independent actors who all just decide to cooperate. Now, those different decisions that they make to cooperate, and the terms on which they decide to agree to do stuff, to share information between them, the router, and how the page is supposed to look when you pull it up on your phone, those agreements, those ideals, those norms, and the fact that we abide by them, that's what internet governance is about. So I guess just to put a more, formal spin on it, internet governance is really just the whole collective of norms, policies, agreements, ideals that we've developed and that we abide by to ensure that the internet continues to deliver for us. That's it. That's what it comes down to in a nutshell. And so the question then becomes, we have a broad sense of what internet governance is. And so the question then becomes, what well, who are some of the people involved in this thing, this internet governance thing? So one of the things I mentioned to you earlier was, well, it's not one person, it's not one group, it's not one community, one government, one institution. It's a bunch of them. They're all independent of each other. And so what you'll find is, so if you go to the next slide you're on just now. So one slide forward, please, yes. So this is pretty much an explanation of what we just went through just now with the Instagram example. You send the request from your device, it goes through a bunch of different iterations on the internet, jumps through a bunch of different networks, then it goes over to the social media site, which is Instagram, or Twitter, Snapchat, whatever it is you use. Now, if we're to use this, there are all these different parties involved. So, for example, the stuff you see when you pull up your browser, those protocols that allow you to see a page the way the person who created the page intended you to see it. So when I decided I want to be a writer and I post up all my great, poems on WordPress or wherever, and you actually see it on your phone the way I intended you to see it, that's because of some good people called the W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. So they're responsible for ensuring that you see stuff the way people intend you to see it, and that everybody in the world will see stuff the way you intend them to see it when you publish stuff to the internet. That's just one body. There is a next body called the IETF. Now, the IETF, they're more for the technical stuff. So if you think about the real behind the scenes, so quick down and dirty explanation of how stuff works on the internet. When you go on your computer and you type in, I don't know, www.cavehill.ue.edu, what you just typed in is called a domain name. And long story short, I'm totally oversimplifying it, but when you do that, you type it into your browser, it's then translated into some numbers. It's called an IP address. Not very fascinating, it's just a bunch of numbers. It basically translates domain names that we can read, cavehill.edu, into a bunch of numbers. Then those numbers are read by the different devices all across the internet that connect them, and then it gets your request to the server that hosts cavehill.edu. Now, the IETF, they're responsible for coming up with a lot of the agreements that we mentioned earlier, a lot of the norms, a lot of the protocols that the different devices on the internet will use to speak to each other so that they'll understand that when you type in facebook.com, what you actually want is to see the big blue strip and your timeline and your feed with your Facebook content. They're responsible for that kind of technical stuff. ICANN is responsible for the actual domain name part, which is the facebook.com. They're responsible for making sure that that actually works and translates. Now, when it comes to stuff like security, let's move away from that stuff and talk about stuff like security. Everybody now is talking about stuff like Internet of Things. Have you guys heard that expression before? Yes. So a big part of the concern that people have nowadays with the Internet of Things is this whole question of security and the appropriate security standards that should be applied to your devices. I mean, if your fridge can go on the internet, surely there should be some kind of baseline security considerations. The people trying to figure out that stuff, the ISO, the International Standards Organization. And we could go on and on and on and go through this list. I could mention others. But the big point to be made is this, that there are a ton of different actors who all have a role to play in ensuring that the internet works. And when they all play their role, that is internet governance in action. Let's go to the next slide, because the things that we tend to overlook very often is that internet governance isn't just this abstract thing that happens, overseas somewhere. It's happening all around us. In fact, it's happening right here, right now. The fact that you're all here in this room, taking part in conversations about what you want the internet to do for you and how it impacts your lives, you're involving yourself in an internet governance conversation, which is enabled by organizations like ISOC Barbados, who are some of the primary persons putting on this event today. There is a regional organization called CARBNOG, for those of you who are more interested in the technical stuff, the networks and how the networks actually work and the new technologies being deployed, that kind of a thing in respect to the networks. CARBNOG, they create these fora for that kind of a thing to happen all the time. And then there's obviously the government of Barbados. I mean, if you think about it, they're the ones who make the laws, who make certain high-level policies that we all have to abide by in Barbados, including the ISPs, which is the internet service providers, people like Digicel and Flow and Ozone, who actually get you on the internet. Those guys have to abide by the laws made by the government of Barbados. So they're a pretty significant actor as well. And as I mentioned, the ISPs, they're groups, civil society type organizations, which you could put ISOC in that category as well, but also groups like Civic, which is a Caribbean ICT stakeholders virtual community. And this is essentially a sort of platform for persons from civil society, but also from government, from the business sector and so on, to sort of meet to discuss issues to do with ICTs and development that are pertinent and pressing here in the Caribbean. And again, this is not at all an exhaustive list. It's really just to give you a sense of how vast and how varied this whole thing of internet governance and the different spaces where these conversations are had. Now, so we've more or less sort of unraveled in a basic, straightforward way what on earth this thing called internet governance is. And we've sort of, looked at some of the key actors. And then the question kind of becomes now, well, why on earth should any of you care? And it comes down to this. In a real sense, you ought to care because it impacts your lives in a meaningful way. Hold on. I don't think it's on. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's working now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Bartlett, we have a question for you from Janelle Small. How do we get the governments to increase bandwidth for schools that we can use our internet to educate our students, for example, ebooks?
All right. So it might be best for me to tackle that at the end. Can I get a time check? Because I really don't want to go too far past my allotted time. But so I'll tackle that question towards the end because we're almost there. Perfect. So the question is, well, why should you care? And it's because it impacts your life and your experience of the internet. Very often in the Caribbean, we take for granted that, well, if you want to go online, you can just go online. We all have our phones in our pockets right now. If you want to, I mean, I see somebody here, they're now on social media right there. Yes. And it's so easy, and so we take it for granted. But that isn't the case everywhere in the world. Not everyone experiences the internet the way we do, and so very often we tend to take it for granted. And so there are all these pressing issues that, depending on what your interests are, depending on what your job is, you perhaps should be at least paying attention to them. Now, off the top of my head, one of the big issues that sort of, that many persons here in the Caribbean actually are grappling with, and governments and ISPs, is this whole notion of net neutrality. Has anybody ever heard of that before? Ah, wow. It's a very wise audience. I like that. So, but for those of you who don't know, the basic idea is this. Net neutrality, remember we spoke about internet governance, it being like these shared principles, norms, ideals. Net neutrality is what I would call a shared ideal, or at least it used to be a shared ideal, which is if you have control over a network that people need to use to access stuff on the internet, you shouldn't operate that network in a way that's discriminatory. And so, in plain English, you shouldn't slow down Netflix and YouTube just because you can. If people on your network want to watch Netflix to their heart's content, they should. So long as the bandwidth is available and it allows it, they should. You know? And so that's the idea of net neutrality. But there are those who have a different view of it, and perhaps with good reason. I mean, very often they argue that, well, I've put all this money into laying out this network, so why shouldn't I have the right to say what happens on my network? I mean, if you had a house and you had a mango tree in your yard, I don't think anybody should be able to tell you who can eat your mangoes or not. It's that kind of a thing. And my job isn't to come here to tell you what you should think about it, but it's merely to say that it's a live issue right now that many of us in the Caribbean are grappling with. The other issue, which is perhaps related to that, but goes to the whole question of connectivity, is perhaps best dealt with as a question. How many of you are okay with the government just deciding one day to direct all the ISPs, to direct Digicel, to direct Flow, to direct Ozone, and whoever else, to shut off access to Instagram? How many of you would be okay with that? Survey says 0. None of you would be okay with that. But guess what? That's actually a pressing issue that we're dealing with in different parts of the world today, and that we have to be vigilant about and mindful about here in Barbados. That we don't have a government that decides that it's okay to shut people down. 14? More than enough. Now, and the list goes on. Another key one, which I'll just mention, is this whole notion of privacy. And again, it's best dealt with as a question. Again, show of hands. How many of you would be okay with some random person working with the government going in your DMs on Instagram or Twitter? How many of you would be okay with that? And there is one person. So 99% of you would not be okay with that, because that would be a breach of your right to privacy. Yes? That's an issue that we're grappling with today, and it's a live issue. And these are issues, especially at your age, that you perhaps should be concerned about. You should be able to, in private, send somebody a message without having to worry that, there's some random third party reading through all your message and going, okay, all right, that's good, really, that kind of a thing. Now, I could go through a ton more of these, but the point is there are a series of live issues that are being debated in all these different fora that I would have mentioned, and many others. And then there's a kind of sort of throwaway value, which is skill building. When you get involved with internet governance, you get involved with the policy processes and so on, you develop all these skills that are very transferable. So for example, I'm involved with an organization called ICANN, which I would have briefly mentioned earlier. And I get involved with their policy work. And over the years, I've developed practical skills that I can use elsewhere. Negotiations. I now know how to read the temperature of a room fairly effectively. So for example, I can tell that I'm boring that young man to death right now. But I'm getting engagement over here. I'm getting engagement across here. You learn about the technical policy development. You learn how to actually develop a policy from scratch, considering an issue, doing your research, figuring out what the parameters of the solutions are, and actually implementing it. Those are actually transferable skills that you can use in almost any other sphere of life. And so that's perhaps more selfish reason, but a valid reason nonetheless, to get involved in a lot of these sort of policy discussions and debates and what have you. So we've gone through what it is, who are some of the key actors, maybe why you ought to be interested. And then the question then becomes, okay, fine, you've kind of convinced me so far. Well, what do I do with all of this? So there are a number of ways that you can get engaged. And when I say get engaged, it's really very broad. I mean engagement in the broader sense. Not everybody has the time, the bandwidth, the resources to be spending hours and hours trudging through names and numbers, policies, and this, that, and the next, and who should have the right to this domain and all that stuff. But there are more basic ways that you can get involved. Way number one, social media. It's one of the easiest ways to get involved. A lot of these different communities of interest who independently sort of create and develop a lot of these different policies that ensure that the internet actually works, they have a social media presence. And so you can just kind of, like, follow, subscribe, as it were, just to kind of have a broad, high-level view of what's going on in these spaces. And then perhaps you're a bit more interested than that. You have a little bit of time on your hands, and you can join mailing lists, which is where you kind of get to see the conversation happening with all these different persons who are actually debating these issues back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And sometimes in just following a mailing list, you sort of get a sense yourself of what the key issues are and perhaps how those issues will impact you on the ground where you live here in Barbados. In a similar vein, there are working groups, which is where there are concentrated conversations about a particular, perhaps, policy issue that people are trying to figure out and fix right away. And so they've created a working group just to deal with that specific issue. But if that kind of thing isn't your flavor, guess what? In the last presentation, I spoke about your resume. Well, when you go home, you can go and update your resume to say, well, you've been involved in an internet governance forum. You've attended an event. You've been a part of the conversation, because that's what this is today. And don't take it very lightly what we're doing here. This is actually very important. A lot of the things that you guys say, the feedback that you guys give, is the stuff that will feed up into policy documents that the relevant ministries will take note of, that different government functionaries will take note of, that ISPs themselves will perhaps review. So what you're doing by virtue of just being here is actually very important work. And again, beyond that, maybe that's not your flavor. Maybe you're the kind of person you kind of like to do things on your own. You see stuff, you read, you reflect on it, you share your point of view. Write about stuff. Start a blog. This stuff is free, cheap, easy. It's dead easy. And so that's your way of also engaging. But the important thing is to engage, because the challenge is this. If in the Caribbean we don't engage, it means that other persons from all over the world are making decisions that are going to impact us anyway, and we'll have to live with the consequences of them. So it's in our interest, it's in your interest. I mean, the truth is, many of us here, we're in some ways past it. You guys, I wouldn't say are the future, you guys are now. This is about your lives and the quality of life that you want and how you want to use the internet, the quality of access you want to the internet, whether or not you even get to use the internet. These are all issues that will impact you guys. And so it is in your interest to bring your perspective to bear on them. I think that's essentially it. So thank you so much for your time. And I would definitely love to jump into the questions right now, if there are any. So if you could pull back that question. There was a question earlier about the government. Yes.
Hello. How do we get the government to increase bandwidth for schools that we can use or internet to educate our students? For example, ebooks, bandwidth?
Okay, so the question really is about resource allocation and how do you get a government to decide that these things are important and then make a decision to put the relevant resources towards those issues. So this is where something called advocacy comes in. people hear advocacy and they think, well, that's something for lawyers in court. I mean, that's a part of it, but advocacy is way bigger than that. Many of you are already advocates, but you perhaps don't realize it. Advocacy is about speaking out about and raising awareness about issues that you care about. That's really it. And so very often, a government may not allocate the resources to things like high-speed internet in schools because it just hasn't realized that this is something that people care about. And so a way to make governments aware that this is something that enough people care about is to engage in different advocacy type activities. And this runs the gamut. This could be from writing letters to the editor to question why this isn't being done. This could be to having fora where you and other persons who share these views discuss them back and forth. This could be sitting down with a relevant minister or a senior official within the ministry to lay the case out for why this is important and why it ought to be done. And so, to my mind, that's my assessment of how you go about achieving that kind of change. Yes.
I will encourage the children to take a part in this next question. How can students get involved with LACRALO? What is the benefit? LACRALO, LACRALO.
Okay, so LACRALO, okay. So LACRALO, okay, now this is about to get slightly technical. If it gets too technical, just tell me, okay, you're going too far, and I'll pull back. So one of the organizations I had mentioned earlier that has something to do with helping the internet to run is this organization called ICANN. Now, how ICANN works is this. When you type in a domain name, www.facebook.com, they ensure that you actually get, whatever the website is you typed in, facebook.com or what have you. That's their job, in a nutshell. Now, they use something called the multi-stakeholder model, which is really just fancy speak for saying everybody should have a say. Government should have a say, business interest. Everyday end users like you and me should have an interest. So as regards the end users, they have a sort of mechanism within ICANN for their voices to be heard. And that mechanism gets feedback from all the different major regions of the world. Now, one of those regions is Latin America and the Caribbean. And that's what LACRALO is about. It's the Latin America and Caribbean Regional at-Large Organization. Wow, that's a mouthful. And the whole purpose of things like LACRALO is more or less gauge or provide feedback from our perspective here in the Caribbean and Latin America. That's what LACRALO is about. Has that answered the question? Well, I guess it's online, so. Perfect. All right, so I think we should be doing okay for time. Are there any more questions? Not all at once, guys. Okay, perfect. So as it stands, we're actually doing well for time. So we can end this section of the program right now. I mean, feel free, if you're not a spotlight person, feel free to find me outside, ask me about whatever it is you're interested in or want to get more information on. Thank you very much for your time.